Well, good try, slugger. All right, but I still see the teeth. I still see the red eyes, right? You're just waiting for a big chomping to occur, right? So slugger, if he is going to try to get that cupcake image, has to recognize there are still some attributes about him that are going to have to be managed because his actions are going to be perceived in a particular way. And if suddenly he's running, right, or he's growling, he's not managed himself, and there's some attributes about him that are challenging. The other thing is, slugger has to recognize there's some people that have different reactions to dogs than others. Now me, I'm kind of naive. Dogs don't scare me. They don't bother me at all. In fact, that's probably not real smart, but they don't bother me, right? I just like the dog. I'll deal with it, right? Now give me a bumblebee, I'm scared to death, but that's a different issue, right? Other people are terrified of dogs, right? You know, there's one, they're walking, they hear some bark, they start doing this, right? They're like that. So there's got to be a social awareness that says, slugger has to realize there's some people that are going to react differently to me just because of who they are. It has nothing to do with who I am. So I've got to, one, try to manage the perceptions of the attributes that I have and be aware that different people are going to react to me in different ways. How do we appear to those who disagree with us? All right? Now, you realize as Christians in the world, from the very beginning, there's a disagreement. Because we have a disagreement with the world, right? We don't live the way the world lives. And so when you think about people outside of Christ, there inherently is a disagreement that begins. We've got a different worldview. We have some truth that we want to convey. You start out, to many of them, looking like slugger. That's the way you look, right? Now, you don't mean to look that way, right? But you look like slugger. That's the way you look. Or, and we'll see some illustrations of this from Scripture, when you need to talk to a brother and sister in Christ where there's an issue or a problem, you look like slugger from the very beginning. Even in our family sometimes, if we have a disagreement, you look like slugger. That's the nature of disagreement. And so you've got to do the things that it takes to look better. Now, we've got to teach truth, no doubt about it. Got to teach truth to the world, got to teach truth in the church, to our brothers and sisters. We've got to teach truth in our families. And when you teach truth, there is by definition going to be a conflict, because what are you trying to do? You are trying to change the way somebody thinks. You begin with a disagreement, therefore you begin as slugger, right? Oh, you're cupcake, you got a good attitude, but it doesn't matter, right? You look like, to them, slugger. Now here's some text. Matthew 5:13. We know all this. You are the salt of the world, right? The salt loses its savor. Now what is the idea of the salt? There is a purity and a distinctiveness that is noticed. The next verse talks about a light not being hid under a bushel, right? Candle, same thing, right? There is a uniqueness, a distinctive, a contrast that we have in our life, in our worldview, in our teaching with the world. From the very beginning, when the gospel came into the world, there was a disagreement. There was a disagreement about who Jesus was. There was a disagreement about who had authority, all authority on heaven and earth, right? There was a disagreement about all these things. And so from the very beginning, as you change the world, and they did, you have this disagreement. It starts. Or you can go to others that have more to do with people that are closer to us, brothers and sisters in Christ. Galatians 6:1. If any man is overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, restore him, right? Now, If you see somebody who's a brother or sister in this room, and they got sin in their life, and you go and talk to them, where does that conversation begin? With a conflict, right? Because most likely, they don't think they have. Oh, sometimes it's like, oh, okay, got a wake-up call. I got it. Thank you. Appreciate that, right? Deal with it. But that's usually not the way that it goes. It's a slugger conversation, right? I look like slugger coming to you, and you're being picky, mean, judgmental, blah, 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 right? What do we do with love to manage those situations so that we are best able to have, this is really the only measure, the change that needs to occur. Matthew 18:15 is another one. If your brother sins against you, go to him, right? And by the way, on that one, it better be a big one. Otherwise, I go to 1 Corinthians 6. Why not rather be defrauded? Because it's a lot less trouble, right? But that's a different issue. James 5:19-20, same thing. The soul that is saved or brought back, right? You come to an individual and say, here's a problem in your life. You're going down the wrong path. You saved a soul from death. These are the things that we do to change the world by teaching truth, whether it's out there or it's in here. But from the very beginning, those opportunities, every one of them, has the potential for some type of conflict that has to do with perceptions of others, right? Whether our intentions and our attitudes are good or not. Now, teaching truth in love. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, you can read that. But that's what it says. Teaching truth in love. Not just truth. That's easy. It's not hard to say you're wrong. And you may be right about that, right? Teaching truth in love is really hard work because it looks at things from the other person's viewpoint entirely and then asks the question, this is what Jesus did with the woman at the well, ask the question, in this circumstance, at this moment, with this person, what is the best way in their best interest for me to convey truth so that they are most likely to receive it? That's the challenge that we have. John chapter 1, verses 14 and 17, twice in that chapter, Jesus Christ came with what? Grace and truth. Grace and truth. You better have grace surrounding your truth or truth will never be received. And don't say you conveyed truth because you didn't. Truth conveyed without grace is not truth conveying. It's grace and truth in combination is the only effective way to actually communicate truth. That's what Jesus did, coming with grace and truth. Turn to Colossians chapter 4. When we think about communicating to the world, communicating to those that are in the church, or even in our families, walk in wisdom. In this particular case, toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace. Now, grace is unmerited favor. Grace is saying, I'm going to do this in a way that is absolutely in your best interests. And by the way, just telling you what you need to hear is not in their best interests, right? It's telling them what they need to hear in a way that has the greatest potential for them to accept it. And that's hard work. And that's true whether we're speaking it, whether we're living it, etc. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. There is a way to answer. There is a way to convey truth. But it always has as its foundation agape. That's how the first century church changed the world, is they demonstrated love in all the things that they were doing. And that people were so amazed about the love for one another and the love for others, it stunned them. It allowed the truth to come through. And so our speech, seasoned with salt. Yeah.
If you go too far with this, then it makes you have to get inside people's heads and figure out what's going on. Because there's 150, maybe 200 people here.
Yeah.
There is no way in the world that you or I or anybody else can get inside the heads of all 150, 200 people here and know what all their different quirks are and know what all their different biases are and say, okay, the way you're presenting information today is the absolute best way for all 250 people. We can't do that. I don't think God holds us responsible for that. What he holds us responsible for is making sure that we're not mean about it, that we're gentle with people. That's what love is, because we know what's in their best interests, and we don't want to come across in an obnoxious, mean-spirited sort of way. And that's the best we can do when we're talking to a big audience like this. Now, when you get one-on-one with people and you start understanding, their personalities and their quirks and things like that on a one-on-one basis, then you can dive into more detail about that. But in a broad audience like this, it is humanly impossible to do something like that.
Which, I think that's right, except for what I would say is then there's some things you don't say in a large audience.
Right.
There's some things you don't say in a large audience.
In other words, there's some truth that cannot be conveyed in this room that might ought to be reserved for one-on-one with people. And I think that's the trick that we have to go through and we have to focus on, because what that does is it says, all I can do in some cases is I look like Slugger and to some people in a large room. And that's what I want to avoid, because it becomes a barrier to communication and communication gets cut off. But we'll go through some more things that kind of talk about this. Let's talk about, and this we're kind of getting here, I've got here a parable of the sower and other excuses. Now, here's the way this comes across, okay? Well, the Bible says that there's different kinds of soils. And the good seed gets planted in the soil, and it's the person who receives it that determines what to do with it. That's not my problem. My job is just put the seed out there. All right, that's right, but watch this continuing illustration. Parable of the sower went forth to sow, laid down a tarp on top of the ground, threw the seed on top, and then wondered why it wasn't received. The issue is not the heart first. The issue is how the seed is conveyed. Now, Jesus' illustration was talking about the hearts of men, and don't get me wrong. In the first century, they certainly did not convict everybody. But they did the hard work to have the greatest potential that the seed would work. Another illustration that's used, good Bible students will know Ezekiel and the parable of the watchtower. The watchtower stood up, for 5 miles apart, and if they saw an oncoming army marching, they would signal from one watchtower to the next to say there's an army coming, and then the statement that's used in the illustration, if you tell them and they don't listen, the blood is on them, but if you don't tell them, the blood is on you, and so our job is to tell them. I got it, but you know what? There was a whole lot of communication that happened before that even started. There was a relationship that was created between the people in those watchtowers on how we're going to communicate and what happens. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about building the bridge so that the communication can effectively happen. And now at times that's the problem that we have. And then the other thing, and Jesus did this all the time, Matthew 7:6, don't throw your pearls before swine. Now, don't take too much of a harshness about that. The point he was trying to make is there are things that there's no use in telling people because it's not going to do any good, at least not at this moment. There's the movie, remember the line from the movie? The truth? You can't handle the truth. Well, there are moments in time when people can't handle the truth, and love is to recognize that at this moment it's not going to do any good. I'm going to pick a different moment or a different person to convey that. And so we see that. We see that all through the Bible. They stood at Mount Sinai. They couldn't see the face of God, and it killed them. Jesus, when he's talking about Nicodemus, he didn't convey all the things. He says you can't handle spiritual things because you don't even understand worldly things. And the parables and the questions that were asked. In the book of Revelation, heaven's not described as it actually is. We can't handle it. So the point is that there are truths that have to be provided based on what people can handle at the moment. And having the knowledge and the intelligence to manage that is key. Karen?
Playing off of what Rocky said, I think the important thing is it would not be appropriate for me to approach someone that I barely know, confronting their sinfulness. And I think this is where Christian fellowship is so important. There's maybe 10 people in here that know my story, that know my circumstances, that know my history, that know, different things that may trigger me in different ways. And it would be those people that I'm closest to, that I have relationship with, that have shown me love and that I love, they would be the appropriate people to come to me and love and talk about my sin versus someone that I barely know. So I think a lot of it has to do with relationship, and I think that's why it's important that we have relationship with each other so that we develop those more intimate relationships.
I think it's exactly right. And to overuse my slugger illustration, ever seen a really big, ferocious-looking dog and a little kid playing with them? Right? There's a relationship there, right, that's occurred. And you can see somebody looking at a dog like that and saying, they actually are my cupcake, right? Okay? But that's a relationship that has occurred. And so then there is a greater potential for communication, even negative communication, to go across and to be effectively used. And whether we're talking about that in the church or whether we're talking about it outside, you've got to be able to start managing that relationship so the communication can flow effectively. Otherwise, you're just wasting time. The other part of don't throw your pearls before swine is the fact that they'll see no use in it and trample you for doing it, right? That's what happens when you have ineffective communication because there are barriers that are there that have nothing to do with the topic. So we say, not people pleasers, but people reasoners, thinking through what is in the best interest of the other person in this context, whether it's a large group or whether it's one-on-one, based on things you know. This is a poem that Emily Dickinson that I think helps some with this, at least on some aspects of this, that has to do with conveying truth. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lighting to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is having enough discernment to know what truth can be conveyed at this time in this moment so that people have it's what Jesus did. There were lots of times where Jesus would plant a seed. He didn't keep going with it, right? Just plant a seed because that's what was needed right then, right? And the whole truth, they couldn't handle the whole truth at that point in time. And that's the discernment that we need to learn. And that's really true love that says what is in the absolute best interest in the other person, even sacrificing what I might like to do or say right now, because I'm offended, because I'm hurt, because of whatever, right? What is in their best interest that it might be received. So, perceptions. What others think matters in communication, accurate or not. Key point, accurate or not, right? Yeah, I know you're not slugger. I know that, right? But if somebody perceives you're slugger, it doesn't matter, right? You're not going to be able to convey truth across that highway. It's not going to work. All right, let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. We won't look at the first thing I have referenced up here, but the basic story is Paul was going all over Asia to gather money to help the poor Christians in Jerusalem because of a famine. And he gathered lots of money from lots of different congregations, and he was taking them back to Jerusalem. And the point of 2 Corinthians is, and he had them select a couple of men to go with him to administer the funds and to be sure it got where it needed to go. Now, was there any danger that Paul was going to steal that money? No. Could Paul say, God knows my heart, and God knows that I'm not going to do anything wrong with his money? That's good. But he also cared how it looked to men. He also cared what the perception was. And so he was very careful and say, I want these people to go so there's absolutely no perception of dishonesty in this. Because it doesn't just matter that God knows your heart. God is interested in how you think about what other people see in you. And that's really hard. It's hard work, but that's what advanced love is all about. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, we talked about 1 Corinthians last week. We were talking about 13. Remember, it's the church that had all these problems, and they sent along questions, and they were dealing with all kinds of things. And in chapters 8, 9, and 10, he's dealing with one specific topic from which he draws a number of really important, far-ranging principles. The topic means nothing to us. It's about meats offered to idols and has to do with their context, etc. But it is critical that we understand the principles that come out of this. Chapter 8, verse 1 in the middle, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. Does truth matter? Absolutely. But truth alone is useless. All it does is puff up. I was reading a number of commentaries preparing for this, and I don't usually do this, but I want to read a couple paragraphs from one of them. Without question, ignorance is a great handicap. The church cannot praise ignorance or make ignorance a principle of its work and reduce either its doctrine or its practices to the level of the ignorant. Yet, knowledge alone, or knowledge unduly stressed, proves dangerous. It tends to puff up, to make a man proud when he is comparing himself with others. Something else is needed in addition to knowledge, something that will enable us to employ our knowledge aright, namely love to God, which naturally includes love to our fellow man, the power that impels us to serve the true interests of all individuals. This love builds up or edifies. Instead of fostering pride in our own hearts and puffing us up, love considers others, aids them in strengthening their spiritual life and in protecting it from danger. That's what we're talking about. We've got the truth. We know that. Everybody knows we can talk about the truth, we can demonstrate the truth, we can prove it. That's not the challenge, right? The challenge is how to best convey it so that it has the greatest potential to be received. That's what we're talking about here. If you drop down from the first part of chapter 8 and go into chapter 9, there's a very interesting discussion. He uses another illustration here in all of chapter 9, and basically it was about preachers being paid. So his initial topic is meat offered to idols, but then he goes on to talk about the fact how he curbs himself to manage perceptions. In this particular case, he goes through a long dissertation in chapter 9 that says, don't preachers have the right to be paid, blah, 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 but I didn't do it. I didn't receive any money from you. And the reason is I wanted to manage the perception that might cause you to misunderstand something. And so I took great personal self-sacrifice in your best interest so that I could best what? Convey truth to you, right? Tremendous thing that Paul did to manage perceptions. Remember how we talked about the woman at the well and Jesus and how he managed perceptions? He did the same thing that was there. And then he lays out this principle towards the end of chapter 9, beginning with verse 19. For though I am free from all men, I made myself a servant to all that I might win the more. Now, when you're a slave to other people, what does that mean? I manage myself in such a way that is in the other person's best interest. Now, that's agape love all the time, right? But it's particularly important when we're conveying truth. To the Jew, I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak, I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Now, I have a way that I think. I'm kind of analytical, logical. Probably figured that out already, right? Other people think differently, right? Some people learn in different ways. Some people learn by illustrations. All kinds of different ways that people learn. Some people are much more emotional and feeling oriented, and that has to be there before there's any kind of... So what do I have to do? I know this about myself, but I run into somebody that's not like that. How do I manage myself that has the greatest potential for them to receive the communication I'm giving? Because that's what's best for them, right? Oh, it's not easiest for me, right? I can turn it into a syllogism and have a great time. But that's not necessarily what's going to work for somebody else, right? And so figuring out how to do that and doing the hard work for that eliminates the barriers of communication. Can't hardly read that. Then chapter 10, 23 and 24. By the way, this goes on for 3 chapters. You think this is important in the book of 1 Corinthians? It's 20% of the book. Notice this, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. Again, there are a lot of things that are true. There are a lot of things that are right. There are a lot of things that I could do. There are a lot of things that I could do that I'm doing from a pure heart. And yet, in any given circumstance, they may be absolutely the wrong thing to do because it's not in the other person's best interest. Now, don't get me wrong. We have to convey truth. I got that. But this is about how and the hard work to anticipate what others need at that particular moment in time. And then finally, verse 32 of chapter 10, give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as also I please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that we may be saved. Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. Who started this? Christ did. Where did he start it? On the cross. On the cross is the highest epitome of sacrificial self-management so that I can help other people, in that case, you and I. Paul says, I'm doing that. I'm doing that by managing perceptions. I'm doing that by making sure people don't misunderstand and therefore block communication. I'm doing that by changing myself depending on the circumstance and the audience that is there so that there is the best opportunity for truth to be conveyed. To the Jew, it became as a Jew. To the Greek, as the Greek, etc. I become all things to all men. Obviously, he's not talking about sinful, but all things to all men that I might be able to save some. It's a sacrificial self-management that says I control myself, I change myself, I adapt to the circumstances to the best of my ability to be able to convey truth. Now, let's bring this into real life. This is a concept that's been around for a long time. It's biblical. It's emotional intelligence for those that are in leadership development or HR or any of those kinds of things. I see Mary Alice smiling. She's probably seen this for 30 years. But anyway, this is about this topic. It's about managing yourself. It's about managing perceptions of others. Let me give you a couple illustrations, one that I do well and one I do not. Every Friday morning, I have a men's Bible study uptown, with a number of executives across a broad spectrum of the Christian world. These are my peers in the workplace. These are really good people in terms of society and business success and all those kinds of things, right? And we just study the Bible, book by book, verse by verse. Now, as you can imagine, I have some things that I would like to say, right? Because we're in a lot of different places in that room. But I have to manage that some, right? First of all, I need some self-awareness. What's my self-awareness? Well, I have a lot of Bible knowledge. And yes, I have more Bible knowledge than people in that room. But that can quickly come across as what? A know-it-all, right? A braggart and a know-it-all. It can happen really fast. And among these people, they've got large organizations. They're very good at reading people, right? They know exactly what's going on. Now, they do value expertise in their roles, right? So when they see expertise, they're going to pull on it when they need it. But I have to be self-aware that I could really come across and completely blow away my influence by that, right? And then there's the social awareness, the context of who's in that room and what they're capable of and what they know and how they think. And actually, you know, in the workplace, these are my peeps. I kind of know how all this game works. Been doing it a while, right? So I can do reasonably well in that context to get points in, to manage it, to help plant seeds, etc., and not destroy that communication. All right? Now, are there contexts where that's really hard for me? You better believe it. You better believe it. Nancy and I were talking, I guess it was yesterday. I had seen something at DMV where, you know, a young mother, 2 kids, obviously having a financial struggle, they like just dealing with the tags on her car. And I'm like, I've forgotten that, right? I just, you know, and we were talking about the fact that, you know, we used to try to manage our grocery budget to $30 a week, right? And I mean, my mind is completely gone, and you lose touch with that. And so when you're in the context of that, my social awareness ability for that group is really low, and it's really hard. And so if you're communicating with people like that, it's really hard to understand the social awareness of what's happening there. And by the way, I probably look like Slugger from the beginning in that group, right? So how do you do that, and how do you work on those things? So here's where this becomes real life. We've only got a few minutes here, and we'll see what you have to say, but this is where it becomes real life. First, know yourself. That's a really big key. Know yourself. You may be shy and quiet. That might come across as arrogant, snobby, right? You don't mean it that way, but it can come across that way. Absolutely can, right? You can think about, and I wrote a few of these down, so better look. You got high standards, right? Perfectionist, high standards, shoot for the goal, right? And then you see something that doesn't meet that standard. Well, you're like, well, I'm trying to do the best here. What's somebody else's view of that? You're judgmental, you're picky, right? That's what happens. So know yourself. How is that potentially going to be conveyed? A little while ago, I used the idea of Bible knowledge. Great. You're not going to hear a better thing from me in terms of that's something you should have, Bible knowledge. But know-it-all, braggart, right? That can come across real fast. Know yourself. What do you look like to other people? Now, that's sort of the first thing. What are your natural attributes? Okay? So that's knowing yourself. Slugger's got some attributes, right? He's got some big teeth, and not a whole lot he can do about that, right? Big jaws, not a whole lot he can do that. But be aware you got big teeth and big jaws, and manage yourself accordingly, right? Maybe you shouldn't be running and charging towards people. Might help, right? So know that you have some inherent things about you that can create blockers in communication that's not going to allow the truth or any other communication to get to them. But then there's social awareness, and this is really hard. Know the context of what's going on, whether it's a group or whether it's an individual person. How are they going to perceive you, right? It's like in the context I was talking about, in that room with those other executives, I don't really have a problem there, right? I know it really well, know how to engage in it, etc. But you remember the story of the girl in Davidson, right? That's a lot harder. It's a lot harder, right? Where there's somebody in a completely different category, and you can pick your category, whether it's economics, race, education, political party, and, by the way, theological view. Understand and try to get some social awareness about what's going on in that way, because it'll help with the communication. But remember what Paul said. Knowledge puffs up. Love edifies. Paul wasn't against it, right? He was saying if you're not doing it with this sacrificial love, it doesn't do any good. So what do you have to say? Thoughts or comments? Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
I have two questions. How do we, in evaluating ourselves and being all things to all people, how do we appear not to be phony? Or just how do we not be phony, not appear? And my second question is, if we are evaluating the social context and how we are going to be perceived, how do we make sure that we're not using that as an excuse and saying, hey, I'm not the person to bring that sin to that person because it's not going to be perceived well, when in reality God may be telling us to tell them truth?
Yeah. So I think the first one, and it's very real. We've all had the situation where we had, preteens and teens and their friends came over and we tried to communicate at that level. And I tried that a few times, and that's a complete failure, right? So, Dad, stop, right? So you get that, okay? So, yeah, phony doesn't work, right? So you have to be very careful about that. But I do think some of it shows up in actions. If you're working with a Jewish person, don't eat a ham sandwich while you're talking. I mean, it's that kind of thing, right? It's that kind of thing. And there are simple things that we can do that will help manage the perception of what they see, and that we're trying to be at least a little bit attuned to who they are and those kind of. Remember Paul in one of the most difficult texts, and I think it's Acts 22. After all that debate in Acts 15 and discussion with the Galatians, he went into the temple and made a sacrifice, which is really an interesting study in and of itself. But I think some of that could well be he was trying to be all things to all people, right? To try to convey that in. So anyway, I think that's part of it. The second thing is really hard, right? So this is the thing of, well, they need to know the truth. And if I don't tell them, God will hold me accountable for that. I get that. And I think there's some truth to that. But I think part of it is, right now, what is the thing that's going to do the best? Because sometimes you can convey truth all you want, it's not going to do any good, right? So it's how do I best do that? I think the agape love, the advanced love here, is really thinking through and saying, what is going to have the best impact at this moment? Because what has happened, and I've seen this, I've seen people do this, they are so intent on making sure they convey the truth, they destroy relationships, right? Well, I don't want to hear that anymore. You keep telling me, I don't want to hear that anymore. You keep telling me. Well, what's the use of that? That's pearls before swine. That's what that is, right? So it's figuring out and thinking that through. A couple things here. No more. I said this was advanced, and it's really hard. So nobody's got this perfect, right? The second thing I would say is, do not judge each other on this, right? There's only one person you should be judging on this topic, and that's the person standing in the mirror, because this is really, really hard stuff. So I don't know that I have the answer other than prayer and consideration of the moment. That's the purest heart that says, what is absolutely in that person's best interest at this moment? Not what I need to do so I feel better, not that, but what is absolutely in their best interest. Yeah.
Something my wife always does when she's challenged with people, or not challenged, but feels like she needs to say something, she just at that moment prays to God and says, give me the words that I need for this person right now.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you can't in yourself do that, but God can give that to you at that moment.
That's right. And so obviously prayer is a key component of this, and making sure our heart's there. But again, putting some hard work into it and thinking it through is key. Barry?
The Apostle Paul's advice to Timothy was, guard your life and doctrine closely. If you do, persevere in them, you'll save both yourself and your hearer. So we have to have the two together.
Yeah, and I think part of guarding your life is love, because that truth without the love doesn't do any good. And so as you guard your life, guard why you tell people things. Guard how you tell people things. Guard when you tell people things, right? In the context of those kind of things. So, okay? Rocky?
Well, again, this is making us having to get too far into people's heads when the concept of love is really, you know, we obviously want people to voluntarily respond to the gospel, and so we need to watch how we behave so that we don't present ourselves in a mean way or obnoxious way so that we run people off. We also need to behave ourselves in a consistent way with what the Christian life is, because when we live a life that's contrary to a Christian life, we run people off that way. But there's numerous verses that talks about us presenting the gospel in a gentle way, and I think that's really all we can do. We can control how we behave. We can control the message that we put out, and we know it's in everybody's best interest to hear the gospel. But in terms of how people perceive us, you know, we don't need to give them ammunition to have a false perception. But people are going to perceive us in a number of ways, like you already said. I mean, what did we learn from the humanism class? As we being religious people, we're going to be lumped in the same category as religious people. And since there's a lot of humanists in this country, they're going to perceive us as dumb, stupid, uneducated, ignorant, overbearing. You're pushing your opinions too far on people, and that's where it's at.
Well, so here's the thing. 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 8 is very clear. It is getting in people's heads. It really is. 1 Corinthians 8 is getting in people's heads. And what I mean by that is they have a perception about meat offered to idols. You need to understand that perception. That's getting in their head and changing it. So I get it, but it's conveying these two things in combination has to be there. Truth and a sacrificial understanding of other people, which means changing myself based on what's in their head or my best perception of their head. That's what 1 Corinthians 8 is all about. I have not convinced you. I got that. But that's really what the thing is and what we're talking about. We'll talk about this some more in the weeks to come, but we're out of time. Appreciate your attention.